The secret power of gold. The cure for the economy. What is the secret power of gold, and how is gold the key to cure America's economic ills? In spite of the fact that America is the world's superpower, it is gaining the dubious distinction of becoming the world's biggest debtor nation, and presently is faced with a daunting economic and monetary crisis that our leaders appear to be powerless to solve. What role does gold play in the solution? How and why have we strayed from the gold standard, and what did the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 do to erode an otherwise healthy monetary system in this country? The average American cannot begin to comprehend the complicated economics of banking, Wall Street, and big government, and how they intertwine to affect our daily lives and futures. Will our children and grandchildren have to bear the burden of today's massive debt? Isn't that why we have the Federal Reserve, to watch over our money and keep a balance in the economy? Wasn't that why it was created in the first place? Unfortunately, the Fed and the bankers are part and parcel of the problem. This pamphlet is about putting the pieces together, realizing how we got into this economic mess, and finding solutions. It is about putting principle over politics and supporting and defending the U.S. Constitution and personal liberty. It is about putting truth and integrity back into government, getting rid of the Federal Reserve, and abolishing the IRS. A nation's money must be backed by value, production, and also coin, gold and silver. Before 1933, on the dollar bill were the words "dollars redeemable in gold." Today the dollar bill says only that it is legal tender, and is backed by nothing. The last thing those who control the money want is a wide-awake, informed public. They would like to keep us in the dark regarding their monetary schemes. Their worst nightmare is that they will be exposed. There is more to gold than its economic power. Gold has many other significant and little-known qualities that are presented later in this pamphlet. Educate and inform the whole mass of people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Thomas Jefferson. Part 1. An exposé of the international bankers. Introduction. The American economy teeters on the brink of bankruptcy. Many banks have closed their doors, and huge corporations and financial institutions are looking for handouts from taxpayers to stay afloat. More and more businesses are failing, unable to operate in the quicksand of rising prices, or having to let go long-time employees. Unemployment in the hundreds of thousands each month is reported by the media. The numbers of homeless are steadily increasing. Our financial system has come a long way since its distant origins among the money lenders of Mesopotamia. There have been great reverses, contractions, and failures, but there have been innovations too. We now have automated telling machines, insurance, mortgages, banking by telephone, and the internet. What is missing is the common man's understanding of finances and its pitfalls. We must learn the fundamental truth about money. What role gold and silver plays in restoring stability to financial markets is our story. The money changers. To understand the failure of this economy, we need to go back in time to the history of the money changers who are even mentioned in the Bible. In medieval times, money changers were goldsmiths. Wealthy merchants gave their gold to goldsmiths for safekeeping. In return, they were given paper receipts. At some point, it occurred to the goldsmiths that they could lend out these receipts, backed by the gold in their possession, and receive interest on them, since the real owners of the gold seldom retrieved their gold all at the same time. Further, they began to lend out more receipts than they actually had gold on hand, and could make even more interest. Soon they were making enormous profits. Not only were they lending out receipts for gold that they had on deposit, but also receipts that were not backed by gold. Banks do the same thing today, but now it is called fractional reserve banking. It is legal, but hardly honest. It is part of the problem we now face. The money lenders went even further. They took their ill-gotten wealth and enticed kings and rulers of state to become indebted to them. Eventually, almost all major nations were drawn into this scheme and came under the control of the lenders. The money changers of today are known as the international bankers. The most important and influential money changers since the 1700s have been of the House of Rothschild. The House of Rothschild. The Rothschild dynasty had its beginning in Frankfurt, Germany, in the mid-18th century. After his father's death, Mayer Amschel Bauer, son of a money lender, changed his name from Bauer to Rothschild, which means red shield in German, for a red shield that hung over the door of the family business. Mayer's fortune began when he adopted the practice of fractional reserve banking and became the financial agent to Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, the richest prince in Europe. William was the grandson of King George I of England. Hesse-Kassel was one of the wealthiest royal houses in Europe. Their income came mainly from loaning out elite Hessian soldiers to foreign countries. William and the Rothschilds made a great deal of money from the American Revolution. When a Hessian soldier was killed in action, A large sum was paid by the English crown to the government of Hesse, none of which was ever given to the man's family. This money gave the Rothschild bankers the finances to expand their banking interests beyond Germany and into other European capitals. Mayer had 5 sons whom he sent out to establish banks in the major capitals of Europe. Amschel stayed at home to run the Frankfurt Bank, Solomon went to Vienna to establish the Austrian branch, Karl began the Naples, Italy branch. James went to Paris, and Nathan started the bank in London, England. The Rothschilds were different from ordinary bankers because they were close to governments and particularly concerned with government debts. They became incredibly wealthy during the 19th century by financing governments to wage war. They came to be called international bankers. International bankers have loaned hundreds of billions of dollars to governments around the world. Naturally, they expect to command considerable influence in the policies of these nations. If the ruler gets out of line, the banker can finance his enemy. If the king doesn't already have an enemy, they simply create one for him. The famous House of Rothschilds was the preeminent player in this game. The Rothschilds' main advantage was their mafia-like closeness and the speedy courier system that kept the 5 houses connected. The Rothschilds received news, whether political or economic, faster than anyone else, including the monarchs, and they understood how to make use of it to turn a situation to their advantage. Their normal correspondence to each other was in code. Their world was one of finance, politics, and secrecy. They carried out espionage with their own intelligence service, but were never caught doing it. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschilds increased their wealth tenfold by smuggling gold to Wellington on the continent during the English blockade of Napoleon's Europe. The Rothschilds had decided the outcome of the wars by putting their financial weight behind Britain. It was Nathan Rothschild, as much as the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. The great poet-philosopher Heinrich Heine said, "Money is the god of our time, and Rothschild is his prophet." By the mid-1800s the common dictum of Europe was, there is only one power in Europe, and that is Rothschild. But the invisibility of the Rothschilds has been carefully cultivated. Though they control scores of industrial, commercial, mining, and tourist corporations, the Rothschild name appears on none of them. The Rothschild influence upon industrial America was profound. Working through the Wall Street firms of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and J. P. Morgan Co., the Rothschilds financed John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Empire, Edward Harriman's railroads, and Andrew Carnegie's steel empire. By then it was estimated that the House of Rothschild controlled half the world's wealth. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Rothschilds were also behind the scenes in the financing of Lenin and Trotsky in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Lenin was sent to Russia in the famous sealed train, with some $5 to $6 million in gold, arranged by the German High Command and Max Warburg, who ran the Rothschild Bank in Frankfurt. Jacob Schiff, senior partner in Kuhn, Loeb & Co., in New York, sank some 20 million Rothschild dollars into the triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. It is interesting to note that, under the Tsars, Russia was the one major European nation without a central bank. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Rothschilds had a central bank in Russia. In 1922, one was formed with most of the foreign capital coming from England. All other banks and industries were nationalized. Lenin said that the establishment of a central bank was 90% of communizing a country. Now the West had an enemy, a socialist Marxist communist state opposed to our free enterprise system, ultimately resulting in the Cold War. Eustace Mullins, America's great historian and author, had this to say: even during the Cold War, the Federal Reserve System continued to finance the Soviet Union, which was never a viable economy. It was a third world economy. And we continued to finance it through the Federal Reserve System, through the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. That's how we kept the Soviet Union going all these years. That's why we had to spend $248 billion a year for defense against this monstrous Soviet Union during the Cold War. It took me many years of research to find out that communism had been totally backed, financed and promoted by the Federal Reserve System. A single ledger page of N. M. Rothschild and Sons listed no fewer than 20 different securities, including bonds issued by the governments of Chile, Egypt, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Japan, Norway, Spain, and Turkey, as well as securities issued by 11 different railways. Among them were 4 in Argentina, 2 in Canada, and 1 in China. Asterisk: a central bank produces the currency for an entire nation and has powers to control interest rates and the money supply for that nation. Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws. Mayer Rothschild. A Brief History of Money in Early America. With the founding of the American colonies, a new country was being wrought out of the wilderness by courage, hard work, and ingenuity. Developing settlements in virgin territory gave rise to a new sense of freedom. But the American colonists were not really free. By the time the Revolutionary War began and the first shots were fired in Lexington, Massachusetts on April 19, 1775, the colonies had been drained of gold and silver coin by British taxation. The taxation of the colonies was a direct result of the British government borrowing money from the Bank of England and having to pay interest on its rising debt. Britain decided to tax the colonies, payable only in gold and silver, in order to pay interest on its huge debt to the Bank of England. Sometime prior to the Revolution, though, the colonies had been prosperous. When British bankers asked Benjamin Franklin what accounted for the prosperity of the colonies, this was his reply. That is simple. In the colonies we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products to pass easily from the producers to the customers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one. Immediately following Franklin's revelation, the English bankers forced King George and Parliament to outlaw colonial money. The colonies were forced onto a gold and silver standard. The prosperity quickly ended, because the people did not have gold or silver coin. Franklin explained in his diary that this was the major cause behind the revolution. The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of the colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of George III and the international bankers was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War. The Continental government, being without coin, was forced to print money to finance the American Revolution. The government made the mistake of printing money without taking production, or the availability of goods, into consideration. The new money eventually became highly inflated because there was too much money coupled with a scarcity of goods. By the end of the war, the Continental currency was worthless. General Washington complained that, a wagonload of money will scarcely purchase a wagonload of provisions. Shoes sold for $5,000 a pair. Yet, colonial scrip had worked so well before the war because only enough currency had been issued to promote a lively trade and commerce. America's central banks. A central bank is an institution that produces the currency for an entire nation, with powers to control interest rates and money supply, or inflation. Early America had three central banks, the Bank of North America, followed by the First Bank of the United States, and the Second Bank of the United States. The proponents promised the bank would end inflation and prevent depression. But the bankers issued millions of dollars in paper currency, backed by nothing, resulting in even more inflation. The House of Rothschild played a part in the establishment of these central banks. Gustavus Myers, in his History of the Great American Fortunes, wrote, "Under the surface, the Rothschilds long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were powers in the old Bank of the United States, abolished by President Andrew Jackson. The American people finally became totally fed up, and when Andrew Jackson ran on his presidential slogan, 'Jackson and no bank,' the citizens voted him in by a landslide. When Congress, urged on by the central bankers, voted to renew the bank's charter, Jackson vetoed it. For 77 years America did well without the control of a central bank until the money changers conspired and orchestrated the passage of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Federal Reserve, a central bank, has endured, shrouded in secrecy, to the present. When the central bankers make money plentiful, they make enormous profits on interest. When they make money scarce, they bankrupt the people and buy up thousands of homes, farms, and business assets for pennies on the dollar. Either way, the money changes profit. The banking elite innocently call this cycle of boom and bust, which they create, the business cycle. Among insiders it is called the periodic fleecing of the flock. The truth is that the international bankers have money manipulation down to a science and can create any kind of condition they want. The following is a memo from the American Bankers Association. It is found in the Congressional Record, dated April 19, 1913. The memo was sent out to member banks in 1891. Notice how it was sent out 3 years in advance of the planned contraction date and confiscation. On September 1, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi, and thousands of them east of the Mississippi as well, at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants as in England. What the American history textbooks of the day fail to teach is that perhaps the greatest struggle in American history was the struggle between Congress and the central bankers. The power to issue and control America's money was transferred back and forth from Congress to the central bankers 8 times. All in all, there have been 4 central banks since the founding of America. The latest and most infamous is the Federal Reserve Bank. Why did Congress pass legislation putting the power to create money, and hence the power to create inflation and depression, in the hands of private bankers, who operate only for private gain? And why did it happen repeatedly, despite the fact that each successive central bank proved to be a miserable failure for the people, and most people didn't even want the banks? One answer comes from a founding father. John Adams. A11 of the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America arises, not from the defects of the Constitution or Confederation, not from want of honor or virtue, so much as from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. The Civil War. Faced with the secession of the South, President Lincoln needed money to fight the Civil War. The New York bankers offered him loans at 24 to 36% interest, which Lincoln refused. He was advised to have Congress pass a bill authorizing the printing of full legal tender Treasury notes to pay his soldiers, which he did. Greenbacks, backed by the credit of the government, helped the Union to win the war. The reaction of the central bankers was expressed in a London Times editorial. If this mischievous financial policy, greenbacks, which has its origin in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then the government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry out its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe. The Federal Reserve Scam. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation that makes its own policies and is not, for the most part, regulated by the U.S. government. It is a private bank that loans all currency at interest to the government. With the Federal Reserve in control of our money, the United States has a debt-based monetary system. All money is created out of debt. When the government needs money to operate, it issues treasury bonds and gives them to the Fed in exchange for new loans. US treasury bonds are the so-called reserves held by the Federal Reserve Bank. A treasury bond is a certificate of government debt, nothing more than a government IOU that accrues interest to the holder. In 1910, 7 men who represented the Rothschild, Warburg, and Rockefeller interests met in secrecy at Jekyll Island, Georgia, to conceive the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, and came under the influence of Colonel House, who advised him to sign the Federal Reserve Act because of heavy sponsorship by the bankers. The worst kind of treachery was involved in the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. First of all, J.P. Morgan and friends had caused the stock market to crash in 1907. Morgan was a great manipulator of money panics and was reputedly an agent for the European banking elite, the Rothschilds. Panic followed, and bank runs became commonplace. Banks failed because many banks were overextended due to fractional reserve lending. Morgan and the international bankers had created the crash and panic in order to convince Congress and the people of the need for a centralized banking system, ostensibly to stabilize banking and the economy. Representative Charles A. Lindbergh, RMN, was outspoken in opposition to the Federal Reserve. The financial system, has been turned over to, the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers the finance system by authority of, a purely profiteering group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. In 1914, he warned, already the Federal Reserve banks have cornered the gold and gold certificates. The establishment of the Federal Reserve System provided the international bankers with an instrument whereby they could run up the national debt and collect enormous interest and, at the same time, gain greater and greater control over the United States government, which, history shows, became the supreme borrower almost overnight. The name, Federal Reserve, is a deception used to make people think that it is actually a part of the government and operates in the public interest. The truth is there is nothing federal about the Federal Reserve, and there are no reserves. The Federal Reserve Bank is a privately owned corporate central bank that operates independently of the US government and exists purely for private profit. One of the best kept secrets of the last century is who are the real owners of the Fed, because the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 provided that the names of the owner banks must remain secret. However, R.E. McMaster, publisher of the newsletter, The Reaper, asked his Swiss and Saudi Arabian contacts which banks held controlling stock. He was told that they were Rothschild Banks of London and Berlin. Lazard Brothers Bank of Paris. Israel Moses Safe Banks of Italy. Warburg Bank of Hamburg and Amsterdam. Lehman Bros. Bank of New York. Kuhn, Loeb Bank of New York. Chase Manhattan Bank of New York. Goldman Sachs Bank of New York. Every one of these 8 banks can be traced back to affiliation with the House of Rothschild. At one point, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was controlled by 5 banks that owned 53% of its stock. These 5 banks were controlled by Nathan N. Rothschild and Sons of London. Control over the U.S. Fed is basically control over the world's money. The Rothschilds also determined the price of gold for the world daily. President Woodrow Wilson, who signed into law the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, became aware of his mistake. In 1919, he said, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by a system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men." The Great Depression. In perhaps the most important work of American economic history ever published, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz argued that it was the Federal Reserve System that bore the primary responsibility for turning the crisis of 1929 into a Great Depression. Let's consider for a moment the Great Depression and what party the Federal Reserve played. It was its policy of easy credit that drove up the stock market, resulting in the 1929 Wall Street crash. Afterwards, the Fed tightened up on the money supply, thus prolonging the Great Depression of the 1930s. At the same time, the Fed was sitting on the greatest stockpile of gold bullion in the world and did nothing to save banks and businesses or to ease the suffering of the people. Was this just stupidity on the part of the Fed's controllers, or was it done deliberately? A number of insiders, including Joseph Kennedy and Bernard Baruch, withdrew their considerable stakes in the stock market early in 1929 before the crash. It was found that J.P. Morgan had not paid 1 cent in income taxes from 1929 to 1931. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon was accused of massive fraud and corruption, so President Hoover packed him off to Britain as ambassador. There was much hard feeling in America toward those who had led the country into depression. It was radio personality Fr. Charles Coughlin who coined the term banksters to describe those held to be responsible. The Great Depression had a direct and indirect impact on European economics and politics. It is entirely possible that, were it not for the Great Depression, Adolf Hitler may never have risen to power in Germany. By 1933, the Nazi Party was losing ground, and the German economy had been recovering nicely after World War I with the help of American and British loans. The Great Depression drove the German economy back into another recession with 6 million unemployed. It was only in desperation that President Hindenburg made Hitler his chancellor, which opened the door to his rise to power. World War I did not yield the results the central bankers desired, i.e., the League of Nations, so the stage was set for another war. The Paris Peace Conference saddled the whipped German nation with enormous reparations impossible to repay, which prevented Germany from making a full recovery. The Fed's easy credit policy led to the 1929 crash and following depression. American loans dried up, and Germany went back into recession. In desperation, the Germany finally accepted Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party as their saviors. The Führer soon put the 6 million unemployed back to work building his war machine. In the 1930s, depositors had to line up outside banks to get their money out. Today, massive amounts are siphoned off with a click of a mouse. The world's financial system is so much more complex and interconnected that financial institutions and banks are even more vulnerable now than they were in the 1920s and 30s. We have already seen the collapse of venerable Wall Street icons, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. Hard-pressed taxpayers have had to bail out giants like AIG, General Motors, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and Wells Fargo, among others. Numerous business and bank closings are still going on, and consumer bankruptcies hit 1.4 million by the end of 2009. The official unemployment rate in the U.S. is nearly 10%, and may actually be double that. Many families are homeless. Not only that, but we are engaged in not one, but two costly foreign wars with their resulting casualties. It would appear that America is in much worse shape than we were in 1929, when the Fed was sitting on a huge gold reserve and America was the world's main creditor. Today we are the world's biggest debtor. Can we count on the Federal Reserve to save us from another Great Depression, or will they only drive us deeper into a financial hole, as they did in the 1930s? I sincerely believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the bank and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. President Thomas Jefferson. The graph above depicts American price levels from 1665 to the present. Note that there was no significant increase for the first 250 years. The little blips upward on the graph occurred during the following wars: the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War, and World War I, when the government issued large quantities of paper monies to pay for these conflicts. After the wars, currency always returned to its previous value. A dollar in 1900 was worth the same as in 1775. But look at the graph's right side. During World War II our money inflated, but instead of resuming its normal value afterwards, it continued inflating out of sight. Around that time, something significant must have occurred to induce this transformation. The changes came from a single factor: the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. In a 2009 interview with Reuters news agency, Texas Congressman Ron Paul said, "The dollar is worth 4 cents compared to what it was worth in 1913, when the Fed was established. That tells you they're not very good at protecting the value of our money. They're the counterfeiters of the world, protected by this secrecy. That has to end." According to the Office of Management and Budget, the USA has the largest budget in history, with a staggering $1.5 trillion deficit. In all, $3.6 trillion, with $630 billion set aside for healthcare reform. DEC 2009. Those who favor a deficit as an alleged anti-recessionary measure tell us that it will be temporary. But there is no such thing as temporary large-scale deficit financing. Harry F. Byrd, U.S. Senator from Virginia, 1958. I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution, taking from the federal government the power of borrowing. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. Gold and the Fort Knox swindle. During the time of the Great Depression, international bankers schemed to get the American gold into their hands. They pressured President Roosevelt to convince the American people that the only way to get out of the Depression was to pool the nation's wealth. In 1933, President Roosevelt signed into law legislation outlawing private ownership of gold bullion and gold coins, with the exception of rare coins. People risked up to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine if they did not turn over their gold to the government. The American people turned in their gold for $20.66 per ounce. The confiscation order was very unpopular, and no one in government would take credit for authoring it. Roosevelt publicly stated that he had not even read it. The Secretary of the Treasury said that he had not read it either. They claimed it was what the experts wanted. With great publicity and fanfare, Roosevelt ordered a new bullion depository built to hold America's gold treasure. In 1936, Fort Knox was completed. Once all the gold had been transferred to the government, the official price of gold was suddenly raised to $35 per ounce. But only foreigners could sell their gold at the new, higher price. The money changers who caused the stock market crash of 1929 had gotten out of the stock market before the crash. They invested in gold at $20.66 per ounce and had it shipped to England. Now they could sell it back to the government for $35 per ounce, nearly doubling their money, while Americans starved during the Depression. Edith Roosevelt, columnist and granddaughter of Presidente Theodore Roosevelt, heard the rumors of gold missing from Fort Knox. She was quoted in a news article. Allegations of missing gold from our Fort Knox vaults are being widely discussed in European financial circles. But what is puzzling is that the administration is not hastening to demonstrate conclusively that there is no cause for concern over our gold treasure, if indeed it is in a position to do so. What happened to the gold? Over the years, the gold in Fort Knox was sold off to European money changers at the $35 per ounce price, when it was illegal for Americans to buy any of their own gold. Chairman of the House Banking Committee from 1920 to 1931, Louis T. McFadden was aware of the sacking of the gold in Fort Knox by European bankers. I think it can hardly be disputed that the statesmen and financiers of Europe are ready to take almost any means to reacquire rapidly the gold stock which Europe lost to America as the result of World War I. Many Americans do not know that the gold had been siphoned off. At the end of World War II, Fort Knox contained over 700 million ounces of gold, an incredible 70% of the entire world's gold supply. No one knows for sure how much gold is left in Fort Knox. And despite the fact that federal law calls for an annual physical audit, there has not been an audit since President Eisenhower ordered one in 1953. By 1971, most of the gold in Fort Knox had been secretly removed and drained back to London. Once the gold was gone from Fort Knox, President Nixon closed the gold window by repealing Roosevelt's Gold Reserve Act of 1934, and it became legal, once again, for Americans to buy gold. Gold prices immediately began to soar. 9 years later, gold sold for $880 per ounce, 25 times what the Fort Knox gold had been sold for. By the end of October 2009, gold sold for over $1,000 per ounce, 30 times what the Fort Knox gold sold for. In 1971, the American dollar went completely off the gold standard. Now it became just another floating currency on the world market. The gold standard was a long time dying. Some of the advantages of a gold standard are exchange rate stability, predictable pricing in trade, and reduced transaction costs. Gold acts as an anchor against inflation. Being on a gold standard also reduces costs of borrowing by committing governments to pursue prudent fiscal and monetary policies. In other words, don't borrow more than you can repay, and cut down on wasteful spending. In the January 1974 issue of National Geographic magazine, the article on gold by Peter T. White had this to say. I find this easier to imagine than to believe, but there's no doubt that the biggest accumulation of gold anywhere, namely 12,600 metric tons, rests on the bedrock of Manhattan, in a vault of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It belongs to some 80 nations that prefer to store it there. The biggest single national gold reserve belongs to the United States. 8,584 tons, down from 21,530 tons in 1950. About half is in Fort Knox and the rest in half a dozen other places. The U.S. Treasury values it all at some $11 billion. When President Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he appointed a group of men called the Gold Commission to study the feasibility of returning to a gold standard. The Gold Commission reported back to Congress that the U.S. Treasury owns no gold at all. The Federal Reserve, as collateral against the national debt, holds in its possession whatever gold remains in Fort Knox. Isn't it astounding that the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and ends up with all our gold? The New World Order. The New World Order being promoted widely in the media consists of three main organizations by which the power elite plan to rule the world. The United Nations can be seen as the first leg of world government. It is intended to serve as both the executive and legislative branch. The second leg is the judicial, the World Court located in the city of The Hague in the Netherlands. The third leg is designed to oversee and control the global economy. This leg consists of three organizations, the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, which are intended to control the money supply for the whole world. These organizations expand and contract credit at will, just as the Fed does in America. The IMF creates electronic money called special drawing rights, SDRs, which are backed by nothing. International bankers have a long-term, three-step plan to establish a world economy, which they have been implementing since the earlier half of the 20th century. A simple outline of the plan is as follows. Step 1. Domination of national economies worldwide by central banks. Step 2. Centralization of regional economies, European Monetary Union, EU, North American Union, and trade agreements like NAFTA. Step 3. Centralization of the world economy with treaties like GATT, ending national independence by eliminating tariffs. During this process, American industry and manufacturing is being dismantled and jobs are being lost to other countries with slave or cheap labor, causing high unemployment and destabilization of the American economy. Step 1 was completed long ago. Steps 2 and 3 are nearing completion. Among central banks, the largest holder of gold is the IMF. The IMF and central banks hold 2/3 of the world's gold supply, giving them the ability to manipulate the gold market. The true motive for crises created by the international bankers is illustrated by this quote by David Rockefeller. We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis and the nation will accept the New World Order. Conclusion. Today in America there seems to be only one politically acceptable idea: government is the answer to all problems. There are forces in this nation who want total power to dictate their agenda and will stop at nothing to achieve it. How have they taken a nation created on the ideals of individual liberty, limited government, and free markets, and gotten us to accept the opposite? Up until 1913, the U.S. was engaged in a natural experiment with wholly free banking. The 1864 Bank Act signified reduced barriers to setting up a privately owned bank. Today the dollar, as a floating currency on the world market, has been drastically devalued. We are caught in an inflationary spiral, with the Fed printing notes like there's no tomorrow. According to the Treasury Department, China is our largest foreign creditor. After China, the second largest holder of U.S. Treasury securities is the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank of New York. According to their official records of April 21, 2010, they owned $771.57 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, on which they are receiving interest of nearly $2 billion a year, which will be compounded every year. As a member bank, the New York Fed also receives a 6% annual dividend on its stock in the Federal Reserve System, with the proceeds going to private interests. President Obama's budget deficit was some $1.8 trillion in fiscal year 2009. 1 trillion is 1 million times 1 million. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner in August 2009 told Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid that if the federal government cannot borrow more money, it would default on its existing debt of $12.1 trillion. Following WWI and WW2, the United States owned the bulk of the world's gold reserves, in the hands of the Federal Reserve System. Those gold reserves have been steadily draining away, and by 1971 America was completely off the gold standard. There is even talk now of replacing the American dollar, which is held by many countries as their reserves, with other currencies, among them the North American Amero. It should be obvious to all that the Fed has been a poor caretaker of our nation's economy. It has come to the point where most members of Congress represent the powerful interest groups that fill their campaign coffers, not the people, us, who vote for them. Congress has given over control of the nation's money to the private bankers. It is time for the people to rise up and demand that monetary control return to Congress, even if it means voting out the criminals who have been bought and paid for. In Part 2, we present recommendations for a return to sanity and stability in the American economy. We may not have all the answers, but it should be abundantly apparent by now that drastic measures must be instituted to save this ship of state, the United States of America, from sinking into monetary oblivion. Money has no motherland, financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. Napoleon Bonaparte. Part 2. 6 Essential Monetary Reforms. Introduction. How can we free America from the economic web that is ensnaring us? Can it be done without disrupting our economy and without violence? The trap was sprung upon us through carefully planned legislation. It can be unsprung the same way. Thank God, we still have the vote. If we are to survive as a nation and take back control of America's economic and monetary policy, then we must elect to the House and Senate at both federal and state levels representatives who are committed to passing strong monetary reforms. We need men and women who cannot be bought or intimidated, with the courage to push the legislation through a Congress with sufficient votes to override a possible presidential veto. It was the states who formed the federal government, not the other way around. Once the states ratified the Constitution, it made the Constitution supreme, that is, the federal government and the states have to stay within the boundaries of the Constitution. The limited powers delegated to the federal government Congress by the Constitution are listed in Article 1, Sec. 8. The 10th Amendment states that any powers not listed in Article 1, Sec. 8 are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Thus, the individual states have the constitutional power to stop all forms of out-of-control federal mandates, or reverse them, when they are not within the powers delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. The powers reserved to the states are the basis of states' sovereignty and form an important check on any unconstitutional abuse of power by the federal government. 1. Repeal the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. It's hard to believe that the Federal Reserve has had an unconstitutional monopoly in controlling the national economy since 1913. Nearly 100 years. In that time, the dollar has shrunk in value to being less than 4 cents. In other words, a dollar today would buy only 4 cents worth of goods sold in 1913. The real reason for the existence of the Federal Reserve in the first place was to help the banks inflate money and credit, and to bail out the banks when they got in trouble. Instead of stabilizing the American economy, as promised, the Fed has been the chief cause of booms and busts in our nation, brought on by inflationary credit. Abolishing the Federal Reserve would be simple. Repeal the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, liquidate the Fed's assets to its creditors, and cancel its holdings of U.S. government and other securities. These actions in themselves would go far to reduce our current national debt. 2. Return to Congress its constitutional mandate to issue and regulate currency. The purpose of repealing the Federal Reserve Act would be to return to Congress its constitutional responsibility to create and regulate our currency. No private bank or anyone affiliated with banking institutions should be allowed to regulate our money and credit, especially a private bank controlled by European bankers. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States of America states, "The Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures." Section 10 states, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts." The issuance of our currency by Congress is not a new idea. It was advocated by Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Jackson, Van Buren, and Lincoln. And before that, it was used very successfully in the American colonies until British bankers had Parliament outlaw colonial currency. Look at a dollar bill. Printed on it over George Washington's head is Federal Reserve Note. What we want instead is United States Note printed at the behest of Congress. This would be money without debt, there would be no interest to pay anyone. 3. Eliminate the income tax. Days before the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, Congress passed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, the Income Tax Amendment. This measure was taken to ensure that the government would be able to pay the interest on the loans gotten from the Federal Reserve Bank. Not one penny of the income tax goes for any other purpose than to service the national debt. Income taxes do not run the government or provide any services to the people. No interest would have accrued, in the first place, had the government issued its own debt-free money. Many people believe that the income tax amendment is illegal, because it appears that not enough states ratified it at the time the amendment was supposedly passed. If you examined the 16th Amendment carefully, you would find that a sufficient number of states never ratified that amendment. U.S. District Court Judge James C. Fox, 2003. Our founding fathers wanted property to be allodial, freehold, free of any superior claim, without any taxes. They were adamant about having no direct taxation. The only tax they allowed was an indirect tax, excise taxes on imported goods. Today, American citizens don't even possess a deed to their homes or land, as it resides in the local courthouse. Our property can be seized if we don't pay our taxes and registrations in a timely fashion. 4. Return to a 100% gold standard and safeguard the gold that is already in the country. In order to have value, paper money must be backed by something of value, something that can be obtained with the money. Gold is the time-honored metal of choice. It has intrinsic worth and keeps its value. Currently, the Federal Reserve has sold most of America's gold that was stored in Fort Knox, and is holding, as collateral, whatever gold remains in Fort Knox. No one knows for sure how much gold is left because the Treasury, in cooperation with the Fed, has refused to do an audit of Fort Knox. Once the Fed is closed down, it will have to return the gold it is holding to the U.S. Treasury. The United States could then go on a partial gold standard. It is important that Congress investigate the transactions of the Fed involving the sale or transfer of most of the gold that was originally in Fort Knox, as some of these exchanges may have been illegal. The only way to stabilize the American economy is to return to a 100% gold standard, where a market-produced metal, such as gold, and to a lesser extent, silver, serve as the standard money, replacing the fiat paper notes printed by the Federal Reserve. The Fed's gold would be revalued and parceled out, Federal Reserve notes called in and exchanged for gold coins minted by the Treasury, the bank's demand deposits exchanged for gold bullion, with the bank's deposits redeemable to its depositors in gold coinage. The U.S. and its banks would then be back in the gold standard with dollars redeemable in gold coin. Then each bank would once more be on its own, responsible for its actions in a free banking system, which has not been seen since before the Civil War. There would be no lender of last resort, such as the Fed, and no taxpayer bailouts down the road. Returning to the gold standard need not be as drastic and complicated as one might think. Once the transition period is over, we shall have the best monetary system ever seen on this planet. There is one other thing that can back our money in addition to gold and silver, and that is productivity. As long as there are abundant goods and services, money has purchasing power, even if it is not 100% backed by gold and silver. For instance, if food were to become unavailable, we couldn't eat our money. American industry and ingenuity must come back to the fore, so that our productivity is soaring. 5. Repeal the National Banking Act of 1864 and require banks to have 100% reserves. It's hard to believe that banking legislation from 1864 is affecting our banks today, but the fact is that this Banking Act sanctions fractional reserve banking, which is dangerous for 3 reasons. First, it gives banks legal permission to have only a small percentage of the money in their possession that has been deposited in their banks. This is the reason that a run on a bank causes a bank to fail. If too many depositors of a given bank want their money returned, the money is not in the bank to give them, only a fraction of it is there. so the bank must close its doors. Second, in fractional reserve banking, the money is deposited in the customer bank accounts, and the banks are then allowed to multiply this money approximately 10 times to give it out as loans. This contributes to inflation, because banks do not multiply national productivity 10 times to match the increased money supply. Production cannot keep up and money becomes inflated, which results in steadily rising prices. The following example may clarify this point. If there are 10 pairs of shoes on the market and $10 in circulation, each pair of shoes will cost $1, assuming people want the shoes. But, if you have $100 in circulation and still only have 10 pairs of shoes, the cost of each pair will be inflated to $10. Third, fractional reserve banking encourages greed and corruption in politics regarding the money supply, which leads to the abuse of power. Creating money out of nothing gives power to manipulate politics, the media, and education, to promote wrong agendas, and to afflict life in general. These are the reasons why the Banking Act of 1864 must be repealed and banks must be required to have 100% reserves. Note, back in 1919, the state legislature of North Dakota established its own bank, the Bank of North Dakota, BND, the only state to do so. It was done in order to free farmers and small businessmen from the clutches of out-of-state bankers and railroad men. Today, North Dakota is the only state projected to have a budget surplus by 2011. It has a growing GNP and jobs waiting to be filled. The BND is not part of the Federal Reserve System. It is 100% owned by the state and is required to operate in the interest of the public. Its stated mission is to deliver sound financial services that promote agriculture, commerce, and industry in North Dakota. The BND is a major reason for the state's prosperity in an otherwise failing economy. We give this example as another option. States could follow North Dakota's lead and create their own banks, using interest-free U.S. notes, independent of the Federal Reserve and its tentacles. 6. Withdraw the United States from the IMF, BIS, and the World Bank. The IMF, the BIS, and the World Bank are designed to centralize the power of the international bankers over the world's economy. The IMF was created in 1944 for the purpose of financing the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. It had a large hand in developing natural resources, originally a boon to many countries. Now the IMF keeps third world countries in chronic debt. The BIS is based in Basel, Switzerland. It is not accountable to any national government. It is an international central bank that serves as bank for 55 central banks of the world, with 20 directors, including Ben Bernanke, director of the Fed, and Timothy Geithner, U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. The World Bank is mainly funded by the U.S. and is based in Washington, D.C. It exploits poor countries' resources by loaning money to the countries with conditions that keep them impoverished and weak. All three organizations are involved in forcing borrower nation to give up their mineral and water rights. They establish population control through abortion and other practices. Conclusion. To disengage the United States from the tentacles of the money changers requires step-by-step legislation, as you can see. But it can be done. The monstrous monetary trap in which we find ourselves has been in the making for centuries. At times we were able to escape from it, but again it caught us. The trap has been slowly closed by pro-banker legislation. One can only speculate that the legislators must have been duped, bought, or intimidated. We know, from a close look at U.S. history, that money changers will resort to murder if need be, because their goals are too important to them. Their agenda is nothing less than world domination. They are almost there. We are their last domino. The American public has been fooled long enough. Millions are awakening to the realization that we have been duped by forces within our own government. We trust that this pamphlet will inspire you to help take back our government and our money from the money changers. Every aspirant for office needs close scrutiny as to his or her honesty, patriotism, and understanding of what is at stake. We must not forget the admonition. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Part 3. The Secret Power of Gold. The Secret Power of Gold. By the year 1914, the gold standard system had brought with it a remarkable expansion of trade and prosperity across the globe. The previous 40 years had seen no big wars or great revolutions. The technological advances of the mid-19th century, railways, steamships, and the telegraph, had spread across the world, opening up vast territories to settlement and trade. International commerce boomed as European capital flowed freely around the globe. Although every so often the system was shaken by financial crisis and banking panics, depressions in trade were short-lived and the world economy had always bounced back. More than anything else, the gold standard was the economic totem of the age. Gold was the lifeblood of the financial system. It was the anchor for most currencies, it provided the foundation for banks, and in a time of war or panic, it served as a store of safety. For the growing middle classes of the world, who provided so much of the savings, the gold standard was more than simply an ingenious system for regulating the issue of currency. It served to reinforce all those Victorian virtues of economy and prudence in public policy. Among bankers, whether in London or New York, Paris or Berlin, it was revered with an almost religious fervor, as a gift of providence, a code of behavior transcending time and place. 5. Then came world change. The Federal Reserve had just been created in 1913. In 1914, World War I began, followed by World War II. Gradually, by 1971, gold no longer provided the anchor for world currencies. Today, the U.S. economy is on the brink of collapse. What then is the secret power of gold? The Rothschilds and all the other international money changers know this secret and hope that you, the American people, will never find it out. One of the benefits of gold is simply that a nation's money, when backed by gold, cannot be tampered with. And its economy cannot be destroyed. What suddenly made the United States a superpower after World War II? The fact that its money was backed by gold. After the war, America was the only leading nation whose economy was backed by gold, with 70% of the world's gold in its possession. Gold is power, and ever since the war, the international bankers have been finding ways to erode that power and funnel the gold into their own coffers, because they know that gold is the key, and ordinary people have so far been unaware of this basic cosmic truth. Gold is accepted worldwide. Gold does not decay or corrode. Gold is easy to refine. Gold cannot be counterfeited, and nobody, not even a government, can print more gold when it needs more money. But the greatest truth of all that goes untold about gold is that it is naturally abundant and can be continuously mined because it actually expands in the earth, just as crystals grow naturally in nature. According to a U.S. Geological Survey estimate, 33,000 metric tons or nearly 1.2 billion ounces of gold wait to be discovered in the United States, mainly in the West. There is no reason to believe that the planet will ever run out of gold while life endures. Humanity has little understanding of the real purpose for which gold exists on this planet. It grows within the earth like a plant, and through it there is constantly pouring a purifying, vitalizing, and balancing current of energy into the very ground we walk upon, as well as into the growth of nature and the very air we breathe. Because of the gold deposits in all mountain ranges, one finds health and vigor in life in the mountains that he cannot find any other place on the earth's surface. The world's physicians have somehow intuited this fact, and frequently send their patients suffering from tuberculosis and other diseases to recover their health at the higher elevations. Few people realize that gold is a necessity for life itself. Scientists have recently realized that plants will not even grow without a minuscule trace of gold in the soil. Gold is also found in the sea. Ancient manuscripts say that all forms of life absorb the radiation of gold. Scholars in the past perceived gold as precipitated sunlight, and they believed that gold in the body stimulated the life force and raised an individual's vibration significantly. Gold is an amazing metal. It can be pounded into a sheet so thin that light passes through it, yet the sheet won't break. Gold can be stretched into wires thinner than human hair, but still will conduct electricity perfectly. The earliest records of the use of gold came from Alexandria, Egypt, and reveal that gold was used for medical purposes, and that over 5,000 years ago its use was fundamental to the healing arts. The Egyptians ingested gold in powdered form for physical, mental, and spiritual purification. The value of ingesting monatomic powdered gold is being rediscovered today, as the health benefits of eating gold are proving to be significant. In today's alternate healing modalities, gold is currently regarded as a powerful strengthening and energizing agent. It is being used in cancer treatments, surgical implants, rejuvenative beauty products, and as a conductor of choice for electronic equipment. Gold implanted in a human body as a medical device will resist the growth of bacteria in that body. Furthermore, it is said that gold will help stabilize the emotions and bring about better mental, emotional, and physical health to those who wear it on their person. Sadly, in this day and age there are many children, and even adults, who have never touched or worn a piece of gold. If we should return to the practice of holding gold, wearing gold on our persons, and using gold as a medium of exchange, we should see a greater emotional and mental balance in the people, as well as vital stability in the economy of our nation. Try meditating on gold, even a gold coin, and see if it doesn't bring you a sense of stability and peace. Numerous esoteric works claim that in important eras of the past, referred to as golden ages, mankind reached high levels of development. Gold was widely in circulation among the masses, and the people wore gold. Myths about these civilizations still remain. During these golden ages, people believed that the free flow of gold stabilized and strengthened the entire economy and benefited every aspect of society. Golden Age civilizations were characterized by technological and spiritual advancement, enlightened behavior, harmony, peace, and the application of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Egyptians coined gold as early as 2,500 years ago. It adorned the Egyptian kings as far back as 4,500 years ago. Gold is no less important today. Gold can still be used as the lodestone for a new golden age of personal and economic freedom. This can come about as new gold is mined and made available, and when the gold that is presently being hoarded by the international bankers is put back into circulation. Within the soul of the American people is a deep desire for liberty, prosperity, and peace. But what most Americans do not realize is that gold is the key to fulfilling these desires, and that the absence of a gold standard in our economy is depriving us of the liberty, prosperity, and peace we seek. There is no freedom without economic freedom. When tyrants wish to assume control, they scheme to get the gold into their hands and out of the hands of the people. A gold standard, 100% of the economy backed by gold, is essential to freedom, because it is impossible to inflate or deflate such an economy. Our founding fathers knew the importance of gold as money and preserved this concept in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 10, of the Constitution says, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin as tender in payment of debts." A gold-backed currency controlled by Congress, and not by bankers, would bring about a rebalancing of the national economy and the strengthening of our personal finances. Would this not usher in an age of peace and prosperity, unequaled in these troubled times? In 1933, gold was confiscated by the government. It was unlawful for American citizens to hold any gold except collectible gold coins. But the country was still on the gold standard until 1971. Congress, in 1985, passed into law the power to create new gold coinage to be available for purchase by the public once more. We need to have the Treasury exchange our paper money for gold, secure the right to be paid in gold, and pay our taxes in gold. Gold should not be hoarded by the international bankers but should be available to be traded freely. The ultimate goal is to get gold into the hands of the people. In Section 2 of this pamphlet, specific needed reforms are listed to effect necessary changes in our government and economy. All of these would lead America back to a gold standard without causing a depression or collapsing the economy. As individuals, right now we can increase the positive effects of gold in our lives by wearing it, thus calming our emotions and stabilizing our psychology. We can set our individual houses in financial order and enhance our economic stability if we buy gold and set aside 0.5 to 1% of our monthly income for this purpose. We can live by the golden rule. For the sake of all incoming generations, and in reverence for our founding fathers and our Constitution, for the salvation of our great nation and all who love freedom, let us drive the money changes out of our national temple and re-establish the United States as a freedom-loving republic with a gold-backed currency as a model for the world. For Pixonaut.